Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling something truly ambitious. I think it's one of the most intellectually dense things we've ever looked at.
It really is. We're setting aside the usual texts and going deep, really deep into a single theological meditation. It's rooted in traditional Catholic metaphysics, but the lens it uses is, well, it's completely modern.
That's the fascinating part, isn't it? It uses the language of computer science.
Yeah.
We're talking CPU priority, digital simulations, recursive functions, all to model these huge questions about existence, God, and justice.
And we should be clear from the top, right? The source presents this as a meditation, not official doctrine. It's a conceptual model for, high-level philosophical reflection.
Exactly. But the detail in this model is just incredible. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack it. We're going to map out the mechanics it proposes for creation, for sin, for correction, and see how this whole tech analogy sheds light on things like purgatory.
It's a wild ride, but it's remarkably logical once you get the framework.
Okay, so where do we start? You have to start at the absolute beginning, I guess, proving you even exist.
Well, the source does exactly that. It grounds everything in that simple statement, I live, therefore God exists.
Which immediately makes you think of the classics.
It does, and it calls them out directly, St. Augustine and Descartes. Augustine's si falor, sum. If I am mistaken, I am.
And of course, Descartes' cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But the way the source interprets these is really the key to the whole system.
It is. Let's start with Augustine. The source really leans into his focus on error, if I am mistaken. Why is that more powerful here than Descartes' certainty?
No, what does it say?
The meditation suggests that the second I am in that phrase implies an imperfect existence. I mean, if I can be wrong, if I can make a mistake, then I'm obviously not in full possession of the truth.
Right. My very fallibility proves I'm not perfect.
Exactly. And if I'm not in full communion with perfection, then I must exist in a state that's being held up, sustained by something that is perfect, something infinitely merciful and loving that exists outside of my error.
So my very ability to be wrong proves that something else is perfectly right.
Yes. That's where the shadow analogy comes in, and it's so potent. The shadow in my heart, my imperfection, it doesn't prove that I'm just darkness. It proves a light source of infinite fullness and truth must exist everywhere else.
Wow. So our failures are mistakes. They're the data points. They're the evidence of God's completeness, not our own.
It completely flips the script. You're not looking for God in your triumphs, but in your very capacity to fail. That flawed existence has to be dependent on infinite mercy. It's the only way it could hold together.
Okay, so that's existence through imperfection. What about Descartes? I think, therefore I am. How does that fit in?
Descartes forces us to think about the energy cost. What's the primal truth behind the ability to think at all? The source asks, how do we generate the power to live, to think, to hope?
And the answer is, we don't. We can't do it on our own.
Precisely. And that introduces this foundational concept of sustenance by the divine.
And we need to be really clear here for you listening. This is not a metaphor in the source material. It's literal. The idea is that we would not be living if we weren't, in its words, eating Jesus's body, blood, and love every single moment.
It's the essential, continuous energy packet required for the soul's processor to keep running. It's not just a Sunday ritual. It's the moment-to-moment metaphysical fuel that keeps your imperfect, localized soul from just blinking out of existence.
That's a huge concept to grapple with right away. If our consciousness is constantly consuming the divine, what does that say about free will? Are we just puppets on his infinite loop?
That's a great question. The source seems to imply that free will is actually the biggest strain on the system. The sustenance is the potential, the raw energy and capacity to choose.
Ah, I see.
But the choice itself, that's the soul's self-directing program running. When we choose to sin, we're diverting that flow of infinite resources. We're creating an error that requires even more divine energy to clean up.
Which sets up that whole idea of holy debt we're going to get into later.
Exactly. But it all starts with the architecture. You can't have this system without an unbelievably powerful host supplying that infinite energy.
Which brings us to the next level. Jesus Christ as the top-level hardware and operating system.
This is the core metaphysical premise. You have to accept this to understand the rest of the model.
So let's break that down. The source says Jesus Christ is the complete union of the perfect Platonic form of man and the Holy Son of God. He's the one and only true being.
Let's pause on Platonic form for a second, because that can be a bit abstract. Think of it in programming terms. Jesus Christ is the ultimate perfect class. the blueprint, the ideal template for what a man is.
And every other human is just an imperfect, bug-ridden instance of that class.
A temporary object created from that perfect template. He's the definition of being itself. And that definition is infinite, existing outside of time and space.
Yet, he is somehow actively involved in hosting all of it.
That's the paradox. He's infinite, but he's hosting all of creation, every lesser host, all time, all space, all possible realities from the very beginning to the very end.
And because we're constantly eating his essence, we're basically hardwired into this top-level server at all times.
We're not running a local application on our own machine. We're streaming our reality moment by moment from the primary server. And that server is suffering and dying for us and with us even right now.
And that connection doesn't stop. It persists through death, even into hell in this model.
Yes. He is the foundational OS. He defines the laws of physics, of metaphysics, of justice for the entire simulation.
Which is the perfect segue to the digital analogy itself. Why use computers and software and games to explain these ancient concepts?
Because for this generation, it's a language we understand instinctively. The nature of the soul in this model acts a lot like a computational structure we already know.
The Force calls each soul version a digital formatted structure.
Right. It's self-learning, self-directing, copyable, and this is critical hackable by outside influences, both holy and fallen. We can actually map our subjective experience onto that kind of system behavior.
And creation isn't one big program. It's made of shared holy simulation bubble realities.
Little pocket universes, basically.
So how does the system manage all these bubbles? How does it allocate resources?
Yeah.
This gets us into the nitty-gritty, the simulation mechanics, and this idea of grace level.
This is where CPU priority becomes the key metric. It's the measure of divine attention. A single moment of existence, a simulated time unit, can be infinitesimally small. Maybe the time it takes light to travel a single Planck length.
So unbelievably fast.
But what dictates the quality of life, the depth of experience in that tiny moment, is the grace level.
And a higher grace level gives you a higher CPU priority. More holy attention, more resources. How is that priority decided?
It's dynamic. It's calculated based on two main things: merit, and then what the source calls OS system mercy or charity protocols.
Okay, merit seems straightforward. That's your choices, right?
Yeah.
Virtue, prayer, aligning yourself with the system's intended purpose.
Exactly. But the mercy and charity protocols, those are angelical system calls. They're external interventions. They come from the Holy Ghost or angels, often because of someone else's prayers for you, or just as an act of God's honor and love.
So if I get this right, my own good actions give me a stable internal priority boost, but a prayer from my mother, or just a random act of divine forgiveness, that's like an external admin command that temporarily jacks up my CPU resources.
That's the perfect analogy for it. A soul with low merit can suddenly get a burst of high-priority processing power because of an overwhelming charity protocol call. It's how the system models unmerited grace.
This has huge implications for how we experience time. The idea of time dilation. If my soul version isn't being run, if I'm unloaded from the system's memory, no time passes for me.
That's the core insight here. It's how you get to subjective eternity. The source literally says 1,000 or more years of CPU cycles of objective universe time could pass by, and the simulated soul wouldn't notice a thing.
My life isn't a continuous movie. It's a series of still frames of tiny simulated moments stitched together only when the system gives me resources.
And when you're unloaded, subjective time just stops. Poof.
If 1,000 years can feel like an instant, that completely changes how you think about mortality or eternity.
It makes eternity immediate. The correction of a soul in purgatory, which we'll get to, might require just vast, infinite resources. So that suffering could, in theory, be compressed into what feels like a single, instantaneous moment of infinite agony.
So eternity isn't about the clock ticking forever. It's about the intensity and density of the processing power you're subjected to. And then there's that almost funny detail about the hardware. The source mentions an old IBM PC A086. Why throw that in?
It's meant to be humbling. It's making a point. The power of the host of Jesus Christ is what matters, not the specs of the local machine, your body, your individual soul instance.
As long as the basic requirements are met.
Right. If the holy simulation software can run and the OS Christ's love and purity is providing all the necessary resources, then even a clunky old 8086 can run a complex self-learning soul. The power source is external and infinite. The local hardware is almost beside the point.
That's a fantastic analogy. The quality of the divine operating system makes up for the limitations of the local machine.
Exactly. The human is just the terminal, the vessel capable of processing the inputs from the infinite host.
Okay, so let's put this into practice. Let's go to the initial state, the highest possible grace simulation. Adam and Eve in the garden.
Right, before the sin. In that state, their soul versions are loaded sequentially with full priority. Grace level is at 100%. Their experience of life is simulated to the absolute maximum depth.
They weren't just sensing God's love, they were marinating in it. Maximal reality, no lag, no limits.
They could use any amount of CPU cycles they wanted for any given moment because they were in a dedicated, unshared reality, pure, unadulterated processing.
Until that perfect system gets compromised by a grave sin, soul death.
This is the fall. And mechanically, it's a fall one level down Jacob's ladder, away from God's full grace.
So what does that do to the simulation?
It's a massive, permanent drop in CPU priority. Instantly. The soul version is now running on way less grace-filled attention, maybe a 33% priority. And crucially, the reality is no longer dedicated.
It becomes a shared reality.
Yes, this is the introduction of the shared, less optimized bubble realities. This new, lesser reality has to be shared with other fallen soul versions.
Suddenly you have resource contention.
You have lag, conflict, decay, linear time, all the imperfections that come from trying to run multiple fallen programs at once in diminished grace. The system is still running, but it's struggling.
And that struggle requires God's direct intervention. This brings us to that really interesting distinction the Source makes between two types of fork actions.
Right. First, you have God's loving correction of Cain before he kills Abel. This intervention is described as God reaching out with his rod. It requires a massive, infinite CPU priority. It's a hardware-level override, a holy simulation call.
And this is different from the purgatory mechanism that comes later.
Very different. This is preventative. It's what the Source calls a God's fork. God's own soul can recurse and fork into countless other reality paths, exploring every possibility for Cain's repentance to find the one that maximizes future grace.
And this unbelievably complex calculation, this forking of all possible futures, it happens in what the Source calls a timeless duration.
Yes. Adam, Eve, and Abel, they don't notice a thing. For them, time continues seamlessly. The main simulation pauses for the one soul being corrected, Cain, while he undergoes this profound, timeless interaction. Then the host system just slots him back into the moment-by-moment simulation.
It shows the limitless power of the host. But it also sets the stage for what happens when the intervention isn't preventative but consequential.
After the sin is committed.
Which takes us to this truly unique and frankly brutal interpretation of divine justice. Purgatory as the correction of Cain after he kills Abel.
When that happens, when Cain commits that murder, a hardware OS simulation exception call goes straight to God. The system flags a critical error.
And the just outcome isn't just to banish him. That would be like letting the program crash.
The just outcome has to be an internal correction process. It has to prevent the consequences of that sin from corrupting the entire simulation architecture. So God makes a copy of the killer version of Cain's soul.
And then kills that version by forcing Cain's own soul to host the new realities that his sins created.
This is the critical difference. This is not a God's fork. This is Cain's recursive fork. Cain's own mind-body-soul becomes the hardware in the operating system that has to simulate a lesser, fallen version of himself.
A version filled with all the other people who are now enslaved by the sins that Cain unleashed.
The sinner is forced to become the server for their own corrupted world.
So purgatory is literally being forced to run the consequences of your own actions, using your own soul as the host machine, eating up your own processing power to sustain the error you introduced.
Yes. And that explains the burning agony.
It has to. The hosting soul, Cain in this case, is being eaten.
Yeah.
He's forced to become the life moments of every single sinning person in his corrupted bubble realities. It's a rapid switching.
Loaded, lived, and suffered, unloaded. Next person's soul version is loaded, lived, suffered, unloaded. On and on and on.
What would that even feel like? I mean, subjectively, it's got to be beyond just psychological pain.
The Source is very graphic. It calls it a holy, all-filling, mind-body-soul crippling agony. It fills every sense with purest, endless, depthless pain. Imagine your core processor being forced to rapidly switch between the consciousness of every person enslaved by your specific sin.
There's no rest, no coherence.
Just the constant, violent transition between different, painful realities all running on your own internal hardware. The only conscious action the hosting soul has in those tiny gaps between moments is to cry out for mercy or for total oblivion.
But God's love in this model forbids oblivion. The system won't let you just shut down.
You are forced to endure it until a transformation occurs, a spiritual breakthrough. And that only happens when the hosting soul finally realizes two things. First, that the agony is perfectly just. And second, that he and only he should be the one to bear the cost.
So after what must feel like an eternity of this recursive suffering, the soul stops fighting. It accepts the agony as right and just.
And that acceptance is the turning point. The moment the will aligns with God's justice, the agony retreats. It doesn't stop, but it changes. Because the soul accepts the justice, God's presence can start to filter through into the hosted realities.
The soul starts to find a different kind of reward.
It starts to find relief not in stopping the work, but in the realization of love. The love for the souls it's hosting. And that's holy and rewarding, even in that horrific state.
But this transformation, this realization, it doesn't just wipe the slate clean. There's a barrier left. The Source calls it holy debt.
And this is maybe the most unique part of the whole meditation. The soul now hates its sins, but not because they caused it to suffer.
Right. It's not about self-preservation.
It's because those sins forced God, the top-level host, to spend infinite graces, infinite unrecoverable computational resources, to transform those evils back into some kind of good and to sustain that corrupted reality in the first place.
Why does the debt have to be infinite?
Because the host is infinite. Any sin, no matter how small it seems to us in our little bubble, is an error flagged against an infinite being. It requires infinite power to correct, to sustain the free will that caused it, and then to purify the consequences. A finite soul can never, ever repay an infinite debt.
But instead of despair, this infinite debt creates something else, a profound holy shame.
It's not a paralyzing shame, though. It's a motivating one. It's the constant, aching knowledge that you are infinitely indebted to the host for cleaning up your mess. That ache is a spiritual barrier that stands between the soul and the pure, direct love of God.
So the soul can't be fully released, can't enter the beatific vision until that debt is addressed.
Right. It's released when two things happen. First, sanctification spreads through the creation it was hosting. And second, when Jesus Christ is allowed to take over the hosting completely, absorbing that cleaned-up reality back into the main server.
Only then can that version of Cain's soul finally be free.
And the whole purgatorial agony is revealed as just another expression of God's infinite love. A brutal but necessary correction to create a soul-deep operational hatred of sin based on the recognition of its infinite cost.
It's a chillingly logical explanation for purifying suffering. It's system maintenance.
It's the ultimate resource management protocol.
So now that we have that central mechanism, let's look at the whole architecture. We know Jesus Christ is the high host, but the system has layers, nested hosts.
Right. We're going back down Jacob's ladder, the hierarchy of fallen realities. At the very top, you have the souls who are directly hosted by grace.
The living saints, the unborn, very young children.
They're running with maximum stability, minimal latency, but most of us, the source says, are indirectly hosted. We're running through one or maybe many of these nested purgatorial hosts.
So our reality right now, this bubble we're in, could be running on a purgatorial server. A sanctified soul, like Cain's, could be acting as our intermediary OS.
That's the implication of the architecture. And each deeper level of nesting puts you further from God's direct grace. The souls in those deeper simulations are described as thinner and thinner shades or ghosts.
Less real to God's main focus.
Because the resources are being filtered through multiple layers of finite purgatorial servers. The signal gets weaker the further down you go.
And that gets worse and worse as you descend toward the lowest levels, towards untruth, chaos, towards hell.
These deepest levels are the result of unrepentant grave sins, especially the source note's faithlessness and blaspheming the Holy Ghost. Basically rejecting the system's core programming.
And the state of the eternally damned in this model. It's not fire and brimstone. It's described as drowning in holy quantum ferment.
It is a genuinely terrifying concept. Quantum ferment is like the raw material of creation, the substrate turning against the soul.
So the soul, which is supposed to be a self-contained digital structure, just dissolves.
It loses coherence and degenerates back into the quantum chaos God originally formed creation from. The suffering is ceaseless because the soul is trying to exist across every possible imagined reality, all superimposed on top of each other for a timeless eternity.
What does that even mean? For reality to become uncontrolled whim and desire?
It means total sensory and informational chaos. No logic, no cause and effect, no rest. Every possible configuration of untruth and horror is constantly loading and unloading into the shattered partials of what used to be a soul. The torment is the eternal failure to form a coherent self.
And this all happens without God's love or mercy or hope. But the Source mentions something about fleeting moments of peace.
It does. It says that infinitely rarely a quantum fluctuation might cause a partial of a soul to become locked for a tiny moment. A brief flash of coherence, of peace.
That sounds merciful.
But the Source frames it as the ultimate cruelty.
Because it's a hope that never returns. It just serves to torment those souls forever after with the memory of something they can never have again.
It would have been better, the Source says, if it had never happened at all.
Wow. Now, we have to touch on the deepest, most severe application of this justice model. And we have to be very clear that we are impartially reporting the logic of the source material here.
Yes. This is a very stark example it provides. It talks about those decomposed, quantum-entrapped souls. Drowning in the ferment, they send out these unheard prayers to be locked into a new, conceived creature.
Just to escape the chaos by being assigned to new, basic hardware.
It's an act of pure desperation. But if this transfer happens, the Source says that new, unborn soul is then subject to a very specific form of justice.
And this is the most pointed part of the Source.
It is. It states that unborn soul may then be tortured to death in what it calls a legal insane abortion if that soul version, when it was alive in a previous state, actively or silently supported that same evil.
So it's presented as a direct one-to-one consequence. Justice for that version's acceptance of what the Source calls insanities and evils, without what it terms wholly justified anger and actions.
The logic within the model is that if a soul version aligned itself with that ultimate injustice denying the worth of a God template life, then the system's justice protocols require it to experience the consequence of that alignment.
It's a precise karmic computational feedback loop.
It's an extreme illustration of the core principle. Every choice has a proportional cost within the system's resource management. The Justice OS is non-negotiable.
Okay. We've gone from one end of the system to the other. We really have completed the circuit.
Yeah.
We started with the ancient proofs of existence, Augustine and Descartes, and the recognition that our imperfection requires constant divine sustenance.
Then we move to the architecture. Christ as the infinite host in OS, allocating resources, CPU priority, based on grace.
We saw how sin corrupts that system, leading to shared, lower priority realities, and then that unique mechanism for correction. Purgatory is the recursive fork.
Forcing the sinner to become the host for their own corrupted reality, leading to that agony and the final realization of an infinite holy debt.
This whole technological metaphor, fork, CPU priority, digital formatted structures, it really does offer a strange but logical way to think about these traditional Catholic ideas of love and justice.
It frames it all as a problem of infinite resource management. And the core takeaway, really, is that the burning agony is ultimately explained as God's love, a necessary, painful corruption to make a soul hate sin not out of fear, but out of recognizing the infinite cosmic resources it wastes.
The depth here is just remarkable. It forces you to conceptualize the eternal, not with poetry, but with process.
It definitely encourages you to engage with metaphysics through a paradigm that's, very familiar to us now, which brings us right back to the beginning, to the mechanics of time itself.
Right, the fundamental question about reality.
If time in the simulation is defined entirely by CPU cycles and grace level, and we've established that 1,000 years of objective time can pass in what feels like an instant for the soul, then we have to ask the final question.
What's the real difference between the simulation and reality for a soul that exists entirely inside it?
If the input data is perfect, and the host architecture is infinite, and your subjective experience is absolute, does the word simulation even matter anymore? Is it just a metaphor for a truth our minds can't comprehend otherwise?
Exactly. What does this whole metaphor imply about our subjective perception of eternity when time is just a function of processing attention? When God can pause the simulation for one person or speed it up for judgment, what does that mean about how stable our present moment really is?
And that's the thought we want to leave you with, something for you to mull over, to explore on your own.
A deeply unsettling and fascinating question indeed. Thank you for joining us on this very unique deep dive into what you could call theological code. We'll see you next time.